Okay, I hope you can hear me now. And we're just about to get started. Different location, sitting down. I've been on my feet all day, so I decided to sit down for tonight's class. Hey, Terry, so nice to see you here. And everyone else who's coming in. Welcome, everybody. All right, so tonight, we're going to be talking about fatty liver disease. And one of the reasons why I decided to do this is because in a span of just a couple days, I had 3 people who I know very well who turn out in just random conversations to tell me that they have fatty liver disease. And I was, I guess, wasn't completely surprised because I know that it's very common. And it really led me to do a little bit of research since I've learned about it many years ago, and really was amazed to discover actually really how prevalent it is. And so I thought it would be an interesting topic, one, because it's so common, 30% of the population of the US, but also because it's another way of looking at human health. Because once we have a general understanding, and we have a few people who are on the call today who are saying that they too have it. And of course, since we have so many people on and 30% of people have it, then it makes sense that that somebody's going to have it. So another reason why I pick various conditions to discuss is because it provides a lens into understanding more about the human body. And in other words, it's like looking at it from a different perspective. And so tonight we're going to be speaking about the liver and fatty liver disease to broaden our understanding of overall metabolic health, because we're going to be focusing a lot on metabolic health. And now metabolic health, metabolism basically means the processing of nutrients and how your body is regulating itself. And so when we have a clear understanding of what's gone wrong, it gives us some information about how to correct the situation. Now, there are genetic susceptibilities to having non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And they've done an enormous amount of work looking at what those genetics are. But we have to understand that we go back 100 years and it was a very rare condition. So by looking at the things that have changed in the modern society, which we'll go through in tonight's class, it gives us a little bit of better understanding about the situation. So we'll start with demographics. And as I said, it's 1/3 of the population. But actually, maybe it's best if we start talking about what the liver actually does. So one of the things, there are basically 5 functions to the liver. The first is that it produces bile. And we know if you've ever been sick and you've been vomiting bile is released by the liver. It's almost like a detergent. It is like an emulsifier, and it allows for the digestion of fats in your body. It gets passed to the gallbladder, and then from the gallbladder releases the bile into the intestine to help with digestion. The liver also is responsible for getting rid of cholesterol. It also gets rid of cholesterol partly through the bile, as well as hormones and drugs. It transforms drugs and it excretes drugs. And when I say transforms, in other words, what the body does, what the liver does, is it's involved in detoxification. And the way it does that is it attaches various things onto the chemicals so that they can be pulled out of the body through various means. And that's how it deals with toxins as well. The toxins are basically appended. In other words, there's like an appendage put onto the chemical itself so that the body is able to then take it through various forms of transformation into a different type of chemical so that it can be identified, transformed, and taken out of the body. The liver also is responsible for synthesizing proteins in the blood, like plasma, like albumin. It's responsible for clotting factors. It stores some vitamins and minerals. It stores glycogen. Glycogen is a storable form of carbohydrates. A lot of us don't realize that our bodies do have a small amount of glycogen that can provide a certain amount of carbohydrate use in our bodies. And therefore, athletes often talk about glycogen depletion, where your body can quickly, through a fair amount of exercise, get rid of the glycogen. And then at that point, you're going to need to have another fuel source. And for people who are on a ketogenic diet, when your body is in ketosis, when it's switched from burning sugar to burning fat, your body has consumed all the glycogen that's stored mostly in the liver, but it's also stored a little bit in the muscles as well. And then it also activates enzymes. So there's enzyme activation, which basically means you can think of enzymes as something that allow for a chemical to move from one form to another. Enzymes are involved in all kinds of processes in the body, and a lot of those enzymes get activated. There is an enzyme activation as well. So 1/3 of the population has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because it's not associated with alcohol. Alcohol can, as all of you know, can cause a great deal of problems with the liver, and therefore this is to be distinguished from that, and is therefore called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And quite frankly, a lot of people don't know they have it, even though 1/3 of the population has been determined to have it. Most people don't actually know that they have it. And when I was doing some research for tonight's episode, one of the textbooks said, basically, I'm reading directly from it, screening is not advised in adults attending primary care clinics or high-risk groups attending diabetes or obesity clinics because of uncertainties surrounding tests, treatment options, long-term benefits, and cost effectiveness. Now, that sounds like you almost are in a situation where your doctors are at a loss. They're basically saying that they're not going to screen for you because there are, quote, uncertainties surrounding diagnostic test treatments and long-term benefits. Now, we spoke a little bit about this concept last week, where it turns out that modern medicine in general, unless it has a very specific treatment outcome, a treatment that is going to lead to a very specific measured outcome, there isn't really a push to do the testing because of restrictions when it comes to money. If you're going to do a test, this is their reasoning, and we don't feel like there's any sort of benefit. There's no cost effectiveness at making the diagnosis, and we don't see any long-term benefits, and we don't see many treatment options. What's the point? I think that when you listen to more details about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, you'll realize that correcting metabolism is going to be really important thing. You know what? I have to pause. I apologize for 1 second. I do need to do something. I'll literally be back in 2 minutes. I really apologize. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Family calls. Okay, and thank you all for staying. And actually, we have a bunch more people who came on, so maybe it's not a bad thing that I took a pause. So we spoke a little bit about last week how we can't necessarily rely on you. You can't necessarily rely on someone telling you necessarily that there's not going to be some sort of lifestyle intervention that is going to be the result that's going to help you. Because unfortunately, when it comes to lifestyle interventions, it's very difficult to measure these. And quite frankly, doctors are not really trained or in a position to be able to implement these strategies. And therefore, the cost effectiveness of doing the screening is deemed not to be that great. Obviously, that sounds kind of crazy, and in a sense, it actually is. So we know that even though I've already spoken to you about how there are some genetic issues that are associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the truth of the matter is that we have to understand that this was something that wasn't prevalent many years ago, and therefore we have to we can look at it in a very detailed way and assess from a metabolic perspective what's going on. So we know that it's associated and intertwined with obesity, insulin resistance, and dyslipidemia, or having abnormal amounts of cholesterol. We'll go into a little bit about that as we go through and we talk a little bit about metabolic syndrome. And that is really going to be the core of things. Sorry, I am just getting a bunch of messages that really apologize. Okay, so let's get back to the topic. So we spoke a little bit about how metabolic syndrome is, we're talking about metabolic health. And when it comes to metabolic syndrome, we've spoken about this many times before. And metabolic syndrome is basically a constellation of various things, which include a high BMI, specifically a large abdominal circumference, high triglycerides, reduced HDL, hypertension, and increased blood glucose. And if you have 3 of those, you're basically diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. Now, not everyone with metabolic syndrome has fatty liver disease, and not everyone who is obese has fatty liver disease. But these things are intertwined, and therefore these sort of other factors, that some of which may have not been determined yet, some of which are genetic, familial, some of which could be environmental. All of this we're going to go through briefly as we go through the course, which really is going to give you a little bit more of a better understanding of how these things interact. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, just for your information, 1/3 of those patients progress to something called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is a progression of just general fatty liver. And then 20% of those people will unfortunately progress to liver fibrosis and cirrhosis, which leaves people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with a 12% increased risk of liver-related death in 10 years. Which makes this a pretty significant problem. One that goes back to that thing where makes it sound even worse, where I read here directly, screening is not advised, and therefore it isn't done. And it's also, there are also some problems with trying to figure out what blood abnormalities really are going to lead you to make a firm diagnosis. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what causes an increased risk, and we'll break those down into environmental factors, genetic factors. We'll talk a little bit about biomarkers, blood tests, as well as the microbiome, which comes up, as you know, almost every week. Didn't come up last week, but almost every week. So when it comes to a dietary factor, we spoke briefly already about how this wasn't prevalent 100 years ago. So therefore, let's think about it from a general perspective. I mean, what's different about the diet in America if we go back, say, 100 years ago? Well, there's no question that it's higher in trans fats, which are these fats that are found in baked products. It's probably higher overall in total saturated fats. It's higher in omega-6 fatty acids. We've spoken about that before, and these are things that are like found in seed oils, all of which are mostly rancid. It's what else has changed? Processed carbohydrates, so white flour and sugar and all the refined flours, and less fruits and vegetables. People are eating less fruits and vegetables. The most, we talk about plant pigments, phytonutrients. The most common phytonutrient in the American diet is coffee. It's not coming from vegetables. And coffee, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because it's been shown to be beneficial for this fatty liver disease. Still, you would hope that it would be some sort of leafy green or berries or something of that particular direction. In fact, when you look at the total vegetable consumption, the average vegetable consumption, it's horrifically low. I mean, I don't have that data in front of me, but it's when you look at the total amount of leafy greens, it's like, just a couple leaves, per week. And those are found, on a bun. Maybe it's the lettuce in a hamburger bun. So the amount of these sorts of changes that have gone on are definitely going to play a role in all modern diseases. But thinking about it from a global, 20,000 foot perspective, these are some of the changes that we can identify, and probably we could think about some even more. Another one, which is related directly to this, is high fructose consumption. Now, I don't remember what episode it was, but we spoke about sugars, and we spoke a lot about how fructose, basically when it hits the liver, gets converted into fat. And high fructose consumption is directly associated with fatty liver disease. And therefore, people who have a fatty liver disease do need to be careful with things that have high fructose corn syrup in it. Look, generally berries, fruits have, fructose is called that because it's a fruit sugar. If you're eating lots of berries and some fruits, that's generally not going to be a problem unless it's in the setting of an abnormal amount of calories. And so but generally speaking, we're talking about the added fructose has a much different impact on the body than the fructose that is in your diet if you're eating just some fruits. There are situations, and I've had patients who consume an enormous amount of tropical fruits that have a higher fructose consumption. I had one patient who, I gave him the advice to stick to fruits and vegetables, and he was eating like seven or eight bananas a day, and because I didn't explain to him, he didn't know. This was the first time he had something called hidradenitis suppurativa, and no one had really talked to him about diet at all. And this was just, I didn't have the hour or two to explain everything. So I said, look, try to eat some more fruits and vegetables. And he came back, he had gained some weight. And that's when I found out that he was eating all these bananas. So obviously, you have to be careful. Most people would realize that is, a high consumption of fruit, but you can't assume those things when you're educating people who maybe have never had anyone sit down and talk to them about nutrition at all. It might just seem like a free food if you don't talk about fructose and calorie density of calories and that sort of thing. We also have to realize that there are probably some environmental things going on here. And we've spoken about this in the toxin lecture. I think we've already done 2 toxin lectures. And we spoke about how there are what are called obesogens in the environment. And these are chemicals that can contribute to obesity. Various plastics that can get into your body can cause you to gain weight abnormally. And unfortunately, these can actually be stored in the fat, such that when you're going through sudden weight loss, these can actually be released and actually make you sick. So there are things like phthalates, and you've heard of BPA, bisphenols, these sorts that are found in the lining of cans and in receipts. These things can contribute to obesity. And we spoke at length, you can go back in the other lecture on toxins, where we went into a lot more detail about these obesogens. So I hope you're starting to see that when you're looking at a condition such as this, you really need to keep your mind open to a whole host of different possibilities. One of them being, of course, that there are environmental toxins that are contributing to the obesity, which then is potentially contributing to fatty liver disease. We spoke about fructose already, and you could think of fructose, you could almost classify fructose as an obesogen, because high fructose corn syrup, when you drink those things, I mean, that is, in addition to just being a direct liver toxin and elevating, basically just getting converted to fat and stored as fat, you really can think about it almost as an obesogen. So there are genetic factors, and these genetic factors are actually being studied fairly intensely, because if you can identify potential genetic factors, then that might be able to allow you to come up with a potential solution depending on what that gene is doing. And therefore, there was an interesting study that was looking at nutrigenomics, which is genetic markers that potentially could lead someone to having various problems that could predispose them to fatty liver disease. Now, I've spoken about nutrigenomics in the past because I've done that for many patients. And unfortunately, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, only because the genetic factors that they are determining to be associated with this really are not the things that you're going to get from your routine nutrigenomics lab. However, there are issues with various genes that have been associated directly with conditions, with situations that could lead to fatty liver disease. One is something that's associated with what's called methylation. And another one is choline, which is found in the cell membranes. The diet is found in eggs, and other types of things. People who have a choline deficiency, if they have certain genetic markers, potentially have an increased risk. And would that warrant a nutrigenomic test? These things cost $350 to $400. I can't recommend it, because it's only going to select for a few things that potentially could be associated, but it always does help to optimize the diet in some way. But whether it would have some sort of direct impact on your risk for this particular condition, it remains to be seen. But it certainly can help with overall sort of tailoring your diet in a certain way. The microbiome also, interestingly, there is a very specific type of problem in the microbiome that can be seen in these patients. One of which is microbes that break down fibers, turning them into carbohydrates, which basically means you're getting more carbohydrates than you think you are, because the fiber is actually being converted into another form of carbohydrate. And we'll talk a little bit when we go into when we talk a little bit about what's actually going on in the liver. You realize that sometimes this carbohydrate excess, maybe you're counting your carbs, but you're actually getting more because of these microbes that are breaking down some of the fiber and getting more fuel than is needed. Additionally, in the setting of obesity, there is a microbiome issue. People who are obese often have disordered microbiome. And of course, many of you have probably heard of these studies where they take the microbiome from someone who is overweight and they put it into someone who is thin, and they start to gain weight. And then they take the microbiome of someone who is thin and put it into someone who is heavy, and you see some weight loss. Now, these studies are still ongoing, but there have been some very interesting things there. And therefore, having some idea about how bad your microbiome is, what's going on with your microbiome. There are tests available. Again, unfortunately, all these tests are not covered by insurance. They run always around $300. And so you really have to think hard about whether or not that's something that you want to do, and realize that it's just giving you one piece of the puzzle, and not to really expect it to be the one thing that's going to lead you to figure out what the ultimate cause is. In modern society, medicine in general is focused on coming up with a silver bullet. That's just the way modern medicine is. And quite frankly, with the advance of pharmaceuticals, there are some amazing new medications that really are, just coming to the top of my head. Psoriasis is such a multifactorial disease, but the medications have gotten to be really so tailored to a very specific part of the disease process that, this is going to continue. This feeling of looking for a silver bullet is going to continue to be a theme of modern medicine. But when it comes to lifestyle management of disease and really truly understanding the setting of the disease, what's going on from an environmental and a mental and a physical and a nutritional, all these different aspects, that what's going on, you start to realize that we're dealing with something that is so multifactorial, that there's so many things that need to be taken care of. It's possible that they'll come up with a medication, one medication that's going to reverse this, and I hope they do. I embrace, a lot of these medicines. Not everyone wants to do lifestyle modification. I've said this many, many times because I've counted it over the years. It's 1 in 200 patients that I see, generally speaking, it varies, that really want to undertake a lifestyle modification. People are coming to me because just as doctors have been trained to reach for the latest new medicine, patients are seeing advertising on TV and are also conditioned to want to have sort of that magic bullet. So that's not going to change in any way in the foreseeable future. But for people like you who are on tonight's episode, of course, you have more of an interest in lifestyle medicine and lifestyle modifications. And really, hopefully, I am always in awe of the power of really, I'm in awe of the human body and the complexity of it, and how everything, it's this miraculous symphony that is happening. And when you start to see it in this beautiful way, it really, I think, for me at least, it gives me motivation to be able to make sort of the changes that I need to make in my own life to optimize my health, because it's almost like I sort of feel like you're showing a certain amount of awe and respect for this incredible creation of the human body. And I mean, I hope to sort of impart some of that awe. I know that started with me as a little kid, just looking, and I was always into plant biology, and then that really fascinated me about how complex and beautiful plant physiology and biology was. And then, of course, in medical school, the first day in gross anatomy, and the cadavers in front of you, and you spending that whole year seeing the absolute unbelievable complexity, just anatomically. I mean, you take anatomy away, and you're left with so many other things that are happening that can't be seen with the eye. And it just goes on and on and on. It's just absolutely miraculous. I can't describe it any other way but the word miraculous. All right. Anyway, sorry, that got us off track. So coming back to this notion of obesity causing, it has an associated type of abnormal microbiome called dysbiosis, and that sort of microbiome is also associated with inflammation. And as you know, the point is, we spoke about last week, that it's important for you to have an overall understanding of what your inflammatory rate is. And that's why I recommend that blood test that we spoke about last week called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, something, again, that you can ask your doctor for, because it's covered by insurance mostly, because it can also be an indicator for heart disease. Now you're seeing all these things intertwined. We spoke about how this is associated with metabolic syndrome, with the expanding waist circumference and the abnormal blood sugar and triglycerides and HDL. All these things are starting to sort of link together. And therefore, it is important for you to have a general understanding of your inflammatory rate. Blood tests, generally, they're checking your ALT. I think I'm going to skip going through these. However, I will say that I gave a talk, gosh, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, about adiponectin, which is sort of an up-and-coming blood test. And this potentially could be a marker. Certainly, seeing if you have insulin resistance is going to be very important, and there's certain blood tests for that. But ultimately, you're going to want to know what your blood sugar status is and really sort of get that under control. So what's going on here in the liver? The liver, basically, it's almost like there's metabolic syndrome happening in the liver. You can think of it through various steps. First is, of course, there's excess calories, excess energy that's coming into the liver, and that is getting converted basically when you have more energy than is needed, that glucose, that blood sugar, is going to be converted into fatty acids. And excess fat in the form of excess calories is also going to, of course, be stored as fat as well when it can't be utilized, which is basically going to lead to fat tissue that is growing. And that fat tissue, as it grows, is going to have increased inflammation and other factors that are going to lead to insulin resistance. So here we have excess energy. Body doesn't know what to do with it. Carbohydrates can get stored as fat. Excess fat in the form of excess calories is going to be stored as fat. Blood fat is starting to expand, which is abnormal and is going to cause the fat to release inflammatory markers. We've spoken about how fat is not just sitting there. It's a metabolically active tissue that's releasing various types of things. So here we have expanding fat now, and increased inflammation is going to lead to insulin resistance because of all this inflammation, which ultimately is going to lead to even more fatty acid increase. And unfortunately, the liver is not really capable of clearing all this, and therefore fat starts to get stored in the liver. Unfortunately, at this point, it's almost like a spiral. The fat is stored in the liver, and unfortunately, the liver itself becomes insulin resistance, which triggers even more insulin resistance and more fat accumulation. And unfortunately, then we're left with a situation where there's fat that is being deposited in the liver. So this spiral is ultimately starting again with this sort of excess caloric intake and obesity. But as I said, there are genetic factors. There are certain circumstances where there are genetic issues where people are thin and they have fatty liver disease. We're basically talking about the situation that we have in modern society now, where 1/3 of the population of the United States is dealing with this. So here we have obesity, this insulin resistance that we have that can be associated with obesity. And quite frankly, again, we've spoken many times in many lectures about how insulin resistance, just because you're obese, doesn't necessarily mean that you have insulin resistance. There are people who don't have that. And in one of the lectures, we spoke about how Obesogens, we spoke about those before, as well as things like arsenic can contribute to leading to abnormal blood sugar and insulin resistance with obesity. And when you take some of the toxins away, the rate of associated metabolic syndrome-like issues goes away in the setting of the same amount of obesity. So there are lots of things going on here. Again, it's not a strict obesity equals fatty liver disease equals metabolic syndrome. There's lots of other things going on, and that's part of the reason why this is an instructive way at looking at what's going on overall in the human body through the lens of one particular condition. Okay, so here we've got the insulin resistance, this high level of circulating fatty acids, which is causing more problems, abnormal lipids, triglycerides, all these things that you've heard about before. In addition, you're getting increased oxidative stress. And this oxidative stress, unfortunately, can be, you're getting sugar binding to protein. We've spoken about that before, called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. These things that basically also contribute to things like metabolic syndrome, but also increased just overall stress to the body. When you have these sugar molecules binding to protein, this leads to a whole host of things, such as in the eyes, of course, diabetic problems in the eyes, as well as wrinkling of the skin, a whole host of things happen when you get this elevated sugar leading to it binding to protein. And unfortunately, like I said, this is sort of a spiral in the sense that as the fat builds up, the liver actually starts releasing things which cause more inflammation, which is going to affect metabolic syndrome by itself as well as the liver itself. So that's basically what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about some of the treatments, lifestyle treatments. I'm not really going to go into pharmaceutical medications, but let's talk a little bit about what they've looked at in terms of lifestyle, both dietary lifestyle as well as other lifestyle factors. Now, of course, healthy eating, many dietary interventions have been looked at, and they all have lots of different ways of going about it. There's, of course, people who've looked at vegetarian diets with some success. And obviously, you can be a very unhealthy vegetarian eating potato chips and cereal in the morning. And so we're not talking about that, but we're talking about people who are eating a large amount of leafy greens and such. The Mediterranean diet has been looked at, one in particular where they combined it with CoQ10. And of course, a low-carb diet. And the keto diet has been looked at and has been shown to have success. The problem with that is if you're doing the ketogenic diet for this condition, you really should do it with somebody, with either a doctor who has patients who are doing this. The reason is because if you do keto wrong, it's going to cause things to get worse. What I mean by that is if you've gone low carb, but you haven't gone low carb enough, and you start increasing your fat, that is going to make things even worse because you haven't gotten to such a low threshold that your body has changed and switched to being able to burn fat. And therefore, I can't tell you, unfortunately, I've seen so many patients who are on the keto diet and they've never checked their blood ketones. They just are low carb. And unfortunately, we're dealing with a potentially very, very serious condition here. And if you're going to choose a diet such as the keto diet, you really need to, I believe, do it with someone who has other patients who are doing it for this particular condition. We've spoken about another problem, which is the release of these toxins that are released when you start to suddenly lose an enormous amount of weight. That can happen with the ketogenic diet. And that can cause you to get very, very sick. And that in combination with low fiber in this particular situation can really lead to a high level of even these obesogens, the things that can cause obesity, circulating at very high levels in your bloodstream, as well as other toxins. Therefore, most people who are on the ketogenic diet for this particular condition also increase the amount of fiber. There's also problems with uric acid elevation, which can also cause problems, can cause gout, it can cause worsening of some of the conditions. Now, this is usually just, you don't have uric acid forever. It's usually just a period of time when that happens. But again, it is associated with worsening of, it's one of those things that's seen with high elevation potentially in fatty liver disease, and it goes up early on in a keto diet. So again, all I would say is that if you are interested in doing this, say you have this and you wanted to do a ketogenic diet, that you should look for a clinic or a doctor that has done this with patients of that who have this particular condition. Regular physical exercise is going to be hugely important, and I can't stress enough that just doing cardio, just walking, 15,000 steps a day, let's say you're doing, is not enough unless you do resistance training. You have to work your muscles, because when you're working your muscles, you are just doing that is going to increase your insulin resistance. So much so that just increasing resistance work, even if it's calisthenics, learning to do sit-ups and knee bends and and push-ups, if you to start on your knees, whatever the case may be, you need to start using your muscles. It is so important. It's so important. I don't care how many miles you run or how long you walk. If you're not doing resistance work, ideally with weights or bands, you're not going to see the profound effect. Because once you start using your muscles, your body it's using more energy. That's not the only thing that happens. As I said, it increases insulin resistance, but it also, you're losing muscle as you get older. You have to fight. You have to, as I've said before, you have to be a warrior with your muscles, because even though you may look the same, your muscles are becoming marbled. They're going to look like marbled meat every year that goes by. Your muscles, when you're 20, your muscles look like bison meat. Have you seen like bison meat at the store? It has like no marbling whatsoever. And as you get older, unfortunately, your fat starts to change, and it starts to have fat in it, just like these cows that are fed grain and have marbling in them. That's basically, as you get older, unfortunately, that's the case. And when you don't have as much muscle mass, you're ultimately not going to have the same amount of insulin resistance. So much so that just doing resistance work for just a week or two is going to significantly improve your insulin resistance. And it's also going to improve your overall blood sugar, because your muscles are going to be using that blood sugar. And if your muscles are using that blood sugar, then you're not going to have as much blood sugar around. So high blood sugar is going to be, and because your muscles are so metabolically active, they're going to want to pull in energy, which is going to make your cells more sensitive to insulin, getting rid of the insulin sensitivity. So it's so important. I can't stress it enough. You have to, there is no fitness without resistance work. You must lift weights or use bands or do calisthenics. It is non-negotiable. It is absolutely critical. And I think I've said as much as I want to say about that. Okay. Okay, so generally speaking, well, just losing weight, of course, sustained weight is going to increase your blood sugar. It's going to increase your insulin resistance. It's going to increase your liver. If you have elevated liver enzymes, those can slowly come down with time. And if it's sustained, slowly over time, the liver can actually change. And there is actually been shown to actually reverse some of the damage that has been shown. So you want to have this sustained weight loss. Now, we've spoken before about how, going up and down with your weight can unfortunately cause you to store a little bit more visceral fat, that fat that surrounds the organs. And that, unfortunately, is more metabolically active in a negative way, releasing more inflammation, 3 times more inflammatory than the regular fat. And therefore, it's important that when you work on weight loss, that you do your best to craft a lifestyle that's going to lead to consistent. It can be very slow. It's okay. Consistent but slow weight loss. Yeah, okay, it can go up a little bit. We have we have fluctuations as time goes by, but over months, you should see a sustained weight loss. And that sustained weight loss, again, is what's associated with that improved blood sugar and the insulin resistance and the low enzymes as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about other lifestyle factors, and then we'll call it for the evening. So there actually have been some studies to show that light alcohol potentially could be helpful, but I was not convinced by any of these articles. And I think the overwhelming recommendation is just to avoid alcohol altogether. But for those who are curious, there are some articles to show potentially that light alcohol could help. But most of the rationale by those was that, well, light alcohol has been shown to be somewhat protective, of cardiovascular disease. But even that data has been called into question in regards to light alcohol, unfortunately, because obviously if you have a glass of wine once or twice a week, it's probably not going to be an issue. The whole topic of alcohol is a complicated one. So anyway, in regards to this, there have been some articles. I'm not convinced. Next is coffee. We spoke about at the very beginning. Coffee has been associated with improvement. And therefore, there have been doctors who specialize in this that recommend 2 to 3 cups of coffee per day. And they don't know particularly there are so many different chemicals beneficial chemicals in coffee because it's, quite frankly, it's a plant. So they recommend that. Of course, if you're sensitive to caffeine, there are people out there who have a gene that make them very sensitive, and getting up to the 3 or 4 cups, if they have that gene, has been associated with some negative heart outcomes. But if you don't get jittery, you probably don't have that gene, and therefore 2 to 3 cups has generally been recommended. And then, believe it or not, comes up again, circadian rhythm issues. Like one article, which I'll leave the references, by the way, to people have been asking to leave the reference articles. So if you're interested in where I've gotten all these, all the info, I'm going to list the various articles. You can get that on my YouTube page in the description. I'll put all the references in there. So we've spoken about this circadian rhythm before, haven't we? And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize about the modern science of circadian rhythms is that just about every organ in your body has its own circadian rhythm. Your skin has its own circadian rhythm, believe it or not. Your liver has its own circadian rhythm. And the enzymes, all those enzymes that are doing all the work in their work at different times. So potentially there are better times to eat than others. So believe it or not, there is probably some syncing between the bile that's released from the liver and the microbiome as well. The microbiome has its own rhythm, has its own clock. And so that's led to circumstances where they look at the microbiome of people who are doing various things like time-restricted feeding. That's where you narrow the window of eating from the last meal of the day to the first meal of the next day. People who have a longer period of time have been shown to have reduced overall inflammation in their bodies. And we know especially that if you're eating all the time, that is not really honoring any of the circadian rhythms, certainly not of the feeding process. And so this time-restricted feeding, in addition to being associated with this reduced inflammation, a change in the microbiome associated with reduced inflammation, it's also generally been associated with decreased calorie intake as well. So there are plenty of doctors who do recommend time-restricted feeding. The next issue is something called social jet lag, which has been studied. Now, social jet lag is not associated with social media. It's associated with the fact that what if you are a morning person, okay, and unfortunately you have a job that causes you to get up at 4 a.m. every morning. Therefore, you are chronically in a situation where you're probably 1 or 2 hours off, because your body probably would sleep better at a certain period of time. Now, there are people, obviously, we all know there are morning people, there are evening people, but there are also what are called chronotypes. There was a book that I have not read, but just about everyone I know has read. It's called The Power of When, that talks about the different types of chronotypes. And these are like further delineating, morning person versus an evening person, that sort of thing. And it goes according to bears, wolves, dolphins, and lions. Now, and this is real science, actually. So the bear is a chronotype that wakes easily and typically falls asleep with no problem. And they sort of go according to the sun. So the sun comes up and their productivity is really good in the morning, and they're prone to a little bit of decreased energy in the afternoon. Then there's a wolf. The wolf has trouble waking up in the morning. And one authority said that wolves feel more energetic when they wake up at noon, because their productivity really starts at noon and ends about 4 hours later. Then there are typically lions. Lion types wind down in the evening and end up falling asleep fairly early. And then there are dolphins. Dolphins are people who dolphins, they sleep with one eye closed and they sleep periodically. So a dolphin would basically be someone who really they're just sensitive to different factors. They do have peak productivity windows, according to people who do these studies, but ultimately they don't get enough sleep due to sort of this sensitivity. Now, I only know superficially these chronotypes, and I, quite frankly, am not sure which chronotype I fall into. I don't know if any of those descriptions sound like you. I'd be curious to know if as I went through those, if anyone basically said, "Oh yeah, I'm definitely a bear," or "I'm definitely a wolf," or I'm definitely a dolphin. But quite frankly, I'm not really sure which one I am. So I don't know how helpful that is for me. But the point is that when it comes to this particular condition, believe it or not, and metabolic syndrome in particular, having social jet lag of around 2 hours, meaning if you have like a 2-hour window where you're just not sleeping well, that sort of accumulates over time just because of maybe having to stay up later than you wish to has a twofold increase in metabolic syndrome. Twofold. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's astounding to me that you're getting this particular condition much higher, 2 times, with this social jet lag of 2 hours. And one report actually showed that among pre-diabetic adults in Thailand, each hour of this social jet lag, where you didn't go to sleep when you wanted to go to sleep because of various social situations, increased relative body fat by 3%. Think about that. So anyone who has metabolic syndrome has fatty liver disease, certainly, and metabolic syndrome. You really need to assess your social jet lag. If you're taking care of somebody and you need to get up at night, or you have kids, or whatever the case may be, or you have a job that's keeping you out, this is going to be associated with, unfortunately, a much higher rate of body fat, as well as a significantly increased risk of metabolic syndrome. And remember, we're talking about metabolic syndrome. Again, the high triglycerides, I mean, low HDL, blood sugar, hypertension. We don't want any of these things. And wow, isn't that something that's the case? Next is sleep apnea. And really, sleep apnea, of course, is this sort of collapse of the upper airway that when people go to sleep, which leads to increased levels of decreased oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and then huge risk factor for a whole host of things, including, again, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, insulin resistance, and fatty liver disease, as well as increased sympathetic in other words, increased stress. Basically, your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight, is supercharged. And this is an incredibly horrific problem in the sense of all the things that it leads to. And unfortunately, not all of these things go away with the machines, with the CPAP machines that keep the airway opened. A few of them improve, but unfortunately, some of the risk factors that you would want to go down, unfortunately, don't go down with the CPAP machine. So ultimately, again, it's going to be slow, consistent weight loss that is going to be associated with, again, analyzing all these things from the environmental, making sure the exercise is not excluding resistance work. All these things are going to play a role. And then sleep duration, of course, if you're not getting enough sleep, we spoke about the social issue. But generally speaking, if just you know your chronotype and you're just not sleeping that well, then ultimately that's going to be another issue. There are supplements that have been spoken about. I'll leave an article to an article in the Life Extension Foundation, who has a good article on talking about the supplements. But look, if there are high triglycerides, omega-3 is going to be helpful. Vitamin E has been combined with pharmaceutical meds like statins and it's actually a major treatment for this. But there are others, traditionally speaking, like milk thistle, which has been known to help liver. I'm not recommending any of these. You really need to have a good reason for them. Not to say that I'm saying you shouldn't do supplements, just that you really need to work with someone and have a good reason. Like, again, if you have metabolic syndrome and you have high triglycerides, omega-3s can be incredibly helpful in that particular situation. So that covers everything. And in summary, all I would like to say is that we've spoken tonight about the liver. But what you're finding is that every organ is connected to every other organ. And we're dealing with, again, what I spoke about as a symphony that's going on in the human body. And we can think about this, again, some people having this not as a lifestyle disease, but for those who do have it as a lifestyle disease, thinking about it from the beginning as a condition of excess energy coming in, but also associations with environmental factors and toxins, as well as some genetic factors. But ultimately speaking, thinking about it from a metabolic perspective, where the solutions seem like we've spoken about them many times before, in the sense of how to go about making some of these particular changes. Now, I would add that with the time-restricted feeding, there's also been work done in terms of metabolic syndrome with doing things like fasting mimicking diets, biological fasting, all these sorts of things as well. But that would lead us down a whole different road. But still within the wheelhouse of speaking of things about from a metabolic perspective. So that really covers everything. And just looking at the comments, thank you. Thank you for the comments. And next week we're going to talk about something totally different. We're going to be talking about hair loss next week. And the reason being is because there's actually been a huge, I don't know if I'd call it an epidemic, of people losing their hair from all the stress of COVID. I've certainly seen it in my practice. But also it's actually something that is it's a topic of conversation and worry, very common worry amongst people, both men and women. And just like everything else, believe it or not, when you look at hair it might not be as metabolically prevalent, but I think you'll find it interesting because once you understand hair biology and the stresses that go into causing people to lose hair, it gives you also, again, another additional it's an additional awe-inspiring kind of look at the human body as well. So thank you everyone for your attention. I appreciate everyone for sticking with me, and glad to see some people who I haven't seen in a while on the classes. And what else can I say? Thank you all for your attention, and I'll see you next week. Stay well.